Usman for that great class-based analysis of the entire situation. So what I'm going to do is give a brief outline of U.S. policy towards Pakistan since the invasion of Afghanistan on October 7, 2001. So very simply, I'll focus on what it is that the U.S. has been doing and what the product of that involvement has been. So since the invasion of Afghanistan, the sort of mainstream U.S. line on Pakistan has been that it is a sanctuary, the tribal areas especially, for the militants that are battling U.S. occupation of Afghanistan. And that the Pakistani military, despite its occasional clampdown, has not been doing enough to bring these militants to justice. So that's sort of the official line. In order to rectify the inaction of the Pakistani military, the United States government has been conducting drone strikes in Pakistan since 2004. And it has also been undertaking some other covert operations, which I will talk about later. But I think most importantly, what it has been doing is subsidizing the Pakistani military to actually give it an incentive to take military operations in the tribal areas and even outside them, and also putting pressure on the military to undertake these operations. So far, we know that over $10 billion have been given to the Pakistani military since the invasion of Afghanistan. And the military itself has, at separate points, been put under intense pressure by the United States in order to undertake specific operations. This was especially true in the case of the Swat Valley, which I will also come back to later. So apart from that, that pressure and the subsidies for military operations in the tribal areas and a few areas outside of FATA, the U.S. has been carrying out drone strikes. So far, there have been over 350 drone strikes. I think Usman gave a great description of what actually these drone strikes do and who they're targeting. And apart from these two things, you have covert operations about which not much is known. You have something like Operation Cannonball, which was authorized by the Bush administration in 2006. And as a part of these operations, the CIA would actually send its members into the tribal areas, and it would essentially be on a kill mission. These are called kill-capture missions, but they're almost inevitably kill missions. We didn't actually know much about these operations until a news story broke out in 2008 about an operation that had gone wrong. This was an operation in which the CIA flew some of its members into the tribal areas in a helicopter and attacked a house in which alleged militants were supposedly hiding. What ended up happening was that the CIA killed over 20 people, and most of them were women and children. So this was an operation which actually we learned about in the news, especially after the Pakistani military fired on the CIA helicopter. And this was because this was a new authorization given to the CIA by the Bush administration, which allowed the CIA to undertake these operations without actually informing the Pakistani government, which in the past has not shown any initiative to actually put an end to them. In fact, it's a very convenient way for the Pakistani military to avoid actually undertaking military operations, which it is under pressure to take, but at the same time allow the CIA to carry out operations there. This is not to suggest that the Pakistani military should be going into the tribal areas. The human toll has been horrific, and the operation in Swat especially resulted in the displacement of millions of people. And the military itself uses these operations to further its own economic base, which Usman also talked about. So the CIA has been carrying out these operations, and then quite separately, it has prepared what are called counter-terror pursuit teams in Afghanistan. Now these are Afghan soldiers, and they are under the authority of the CIA. The Afghan military actually has no control over these forces. And what these teams do, these counter-terror pursuit teams, is that they go into the tribal areas. They either make contacts with people, and we don't really know what this is for. It could be for recruitment purposes, for having spies on the ground to gather intelligence for drone strikes. or it could be just to have contacts to figure out what exactly is going on within local areas. More often than not, though, these teams are also authorized to kill their way out of a situation. And these are teams which give the United States plausible deniability, since these are Afghan troops. They are Pashtun, so they are members of the same ethnic group that reside on the other side of the Pakistani border. And the U.S., if something goes wrong, can come out and say that we were not a part of this. So these are two, the counter-terror pursuit teams and the CIA strikes are two areas about which we know very little. We don't know how many operations have happened. We don't know for how long they have been going on, and we don't really know what the results of most of these operations are. The only time we learn about this is when some journalist who is close to people in Washington can actually leak some information, or when something goes wrong, as was the case with the 2008 strike carried out by the CIA. So these are three ways through which the United States has been pursuing its war into Pakistan, extending it from Afghanistan. There's pressure and subsidies to the Pakistani military to take military operations into the tribal areas. There are drone strikes, and there are covert operations conducted largely by the CIA and the special branch of the Afghan military, which is also under the authority of the CIA. So that's what the U.S. has been doing. Now, what has been the effect in Pakistan itself? Usman touched upon the descriptions about the religious groups in Pakistan. I want to focus a little narrowly on the militant groups. There are religious political parties, of course, which take part in elections, and which have accepted the basic legitimacy of the state and which operate mostly within a kind of electoral framework. This doesn't mean that they don't support actions which are anti-state at times, or which are what one scholar, Joshua White, has called vigilante actions, but largely they operate within a kind of electoral framework. But there are religious militant groups, and there are three broad categories. Of course, there are differences within them, but for the time being, I want to look at what their orientation is. So there are sectarian groups in Pakistan, and these are groups like Lashkar-e-Jhangvi and Sipai Sahaba Pakistan. And you don't have to worry about all these names, just the broad orientation of these groups. So these are sectarian groups. They're Sunni, and they usually carry out attacks against the Shia population. Sometimes it also happens against the Ahmadi population and the Christian population, but mostly their target is the Shia population of Pakistan. Then there are Kashmir-oriented groups like Lashkar-e-Taiba and Harkat-ul-Mujahideen, which are also mostly based in Punjab, but they are focused on attacking India within Indian occupied Kashmir. And then there is a third category of groups, and this category is groups that are very locally oriented. So this would be a group like Tehreek-e-Nifaz Shariat-e-Muhammad, which is TNSM for short, and it operated within the Swat Valley. And I'll get back to this group because I think the history of Swat is very important in seeing what exactly have been the effects of the war on terror in Pakistan. So there are these three broad categories of groups. There are sectarian groups, there are Kashmir-oriented groups, and then there are local groups. But since 2007, there has been another broad category, which is that of anti-state militants. And in this you could probably put the Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan, which is the Pakistani version of the Taliban. And I think Usman is absolutely right in saying that this is not one group. There are different factions within this group, and all of these have competing and sometimes conflicting interests. But broadly speaking, most of these groups are anti-state, and I think the ones who aren't anti-state, and these are groups like the Mullah Nazir group and the Hafiz Gul Bahadur group, I think it would be a mistake to actually categorize them as Taliban, because I think they are qualitatively different in how they function. So This group, the Tehreek-e-Taliban in Pakistan, was founded in 2007, in fact. It didn't exist before. There were local groups that existed, and in 2007, all of these groups came together to form the Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan, and actually declared that the Pakistani state itself was now compromised, that it was a lackey of the United States because it had been pursuing the war on terror on behalf of the United States, and that it was now okay, even an ethical responsibility for the group to attack the Pakistani state. So the three ways through which the U.S. has been pursuing this war have led to the creation of this vehemently anti-state group, which has been carrying out attacks in Pakistan since 2007. It has been responsible for most of the suicide bombings. But also, more importantly, the other groups, like the ones that are oriented towards Kashmir and the ones that are sectarian, have also developed links with this group. So after the war in Afghanistan began, after the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan, all of these groups had to confront with the idea of what their responsibility is in relation to the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan. And a lot of the more extreme factions within these groups argued that it was now a responsibility for them to wage war against the United States in Afghanistan. And there were a lot of splits within these groups, with these extreme factions leaving and in fact doing what they said that the group as a whole should do, which is to attack the United States. But as time went on, what a lot of people within these groups realized was that the Pakistani state itself was very intricately involved in this war, and that the state itself had forfeited its right to represent their interests, because a lot of these groups were actually supported by the Pakistani military, especially the Kashmir-oriented groups. So there were further splits within these groups, and a lot of them have actually joined with the Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan and are now carrying an anti-state agenda. This is not to say that it's okay for militant groups to be oriented towards Kashmir or to be sectarian, just not anti-state. But when they were sectarian and Kashmir-oriented, they were still a little bit within the control of the Pakistani military, and it was still possible for the military to actually to pull its support back from these groups. And I think this could have happened if pressure was put on the military by the Pakistani people. So you had Tehreek-e-Taliban in Pakistan, and then there was a local-oriented group, which was the Tehreek-e-Nefaz-e-Shariat Muhammad. And this was a group that operated in the area of Swat, the Swat Valley, which is in an area outside the tribal areas of Pakistan. And so Swat is an interesting case because it used to be a princely state, which basically meant that it wasn't integrated into the legal administration of Pakistan. But in 1994, there was a judgment by the Supreme Court which decided that Swat should in fact be integrated into the formal legal structure of Pakistan. And the group Tehreek-e-Nefaz-e-Shariat Muhammad was founded in 1994. In fact, if you go back to that year and read reports, you would see that this group was founded with the express purpose of refilling the legal vacuum that existed in Swat at that time. And this is also the conclusion reached by scholars who have studied the region. So Pakistani scholar like Asim Sajjad Akhtar, who has done ethnographic work in Swat, he basically reaches the same conclusion that that this group is it arose because there was a need for a legal structure, and this group arose to provide it. And there's also a class basis to this, which I don't have time to get into. But suffice it to say that this group represented the interests of the lower classes and the newly emergent commercial middle class. And that there was a declining feudal structure, there was a lack of a legal structure, and so there was a vacuum which needed to be filled. And unfortunately, it wasn't the government that filled it. What's interesting, though, is that in 2007, after the Taliban were formed in Pakistan, this group, which had a very local agenda, ended up joining this group, joining the Taliban. So what we see is that in the past 10 years, past 11 years actually now, The war on terror in Afghanistan and Pakistan has led to the proliferation of militant groups. It has led to connections within these groups which did not exist prior to this war, and it has led to a shrinking of the social space that's necessary to actually develop a secular leftist politics. And it's also a criticism, not exactly a criticism, but I think the left also needs to look at how the TNSM developed in SWAT, and how it was able to fill a vacuum that the left wasn't able to fill, because SWAT actually has a history of leftist groups that were protesting against the feudal structure there, and this was decimated in the 1980s under the dictatorship of Zia ul-Haq, which Osman also talked about. So I think the war on terror, in as much as drones are a component of it, has to be looked at as a whole, and we have to look at how the Pakistani military has been complicit in pursuing this war, even though there are limits that it imposes on itself in order to protect its own interests, and that the perennial US complaint that Pakistan is not doing enough, that it is playing a double game, is in fact a complaint that Pakistan is not fully aligning itself with American interests. So I think the focus on drones itself, I think, is a bit mistaken, that we should focus on the war itself as a whole, because drone strikes are a component of the war, and there are different ways through which this war is being pursued, which are equally or more devastating to the Pakistani people and to long-term prospects of leftist secular politics.